Welcome to CTIC's 30th anniversary celebration. We're so glad that you're here with us. I'm Karen Scanlon, Executive Director of the Conservation Technology Information Center. And again, welcome. We're so glad that you're here. And I want to say a special thank you to our host today, Monsanto. They have been incredible helping us to organize this event. And I want to say particularly a thank you to Dave Gustafson. He is a fellow and director here at Monsanto, and he's also serves on the CTIC Board of Directors. So thank you, Dave. And I've lost sight of you. There you are. Thank you. And also Carolyn Daly works with Dave and has been irreplaceable and very much helping to pull this off. So we thank Carolyn, as well as Susie St. Cyr. She has been just fantastic in helping everything to go smoothly. If you think this event is going well, then it's those two that we have to thank. So we thank them as well. A couple more people to thank. We thank Syngenta for their support for our 30th anniversary, as well as the Mosaic Company. These generous members and sponsors of CTIC have made the year-long celebration of our 30th anniversary possible, and all of CTIC's members have made our 30 years possible. So to those members that are here in the room, we thank you. So right now, I'm pleased to introduce Brent Begeman. He is Monsanto's President and Chief Commercial Officer. It's his job to oversee the global company's commercial, manufacturing, and supply chain operations in row crops, vegetables, and crop protection products. Brent has a long history in agriculture, beginning on a diversified grain and livestock farm in Missouri, where he grew up. And over his 29 years with Monsanto, Brent has served on a variety of roles, including sales, marketing, commercial development, and general management in the U.S. and abroad. So he's going to make a few brief comments about Monsanto and their commitment to sustainability and conservation. Brent.
Good afternoon. And let me also add my warm welcome to all of you for joining us here at Monsanto. It's fantastic to have the opportunity to welcome all of you here in St. Louis and on our campus. And let me just start right off the bat, say a hearty congratulations to 30 years to CTIC. What phenomenal work you've done over those 30 years and the differences you've made for agriculture. You know, I was just reflecting on this earlier today about coming over here. And I spent all my life in agriculture, growing up as a farm kid and then going to work for Monsanto. And I remind myself of when I went to Minnesota, southwest Minnesota, flat and black like Illinois and Iowa, like the gentleman I was talking to at lunch. And they were farming a bit differently up there than we are today. And what's gone on with CTIC, as well as many other people in the industry, and the innovations that have come to agriculture to change the way we farm for the better, has been nothing short of spectacular. And I just can't imagine any other industry that's been through as much innovation and change as production agriculture's been through in that 30-year period. And coincidentally, your 30 years of CTIC, I'm about 6 months behind that in 30 years with Monsanto. So it's been there that I've seen a lot of that happen. Going back to the early days of when I first saw the moldboard plows finally starting to get parked in the fence row, and there's people now that I run into that don't know what a moldboard plow is. They've been farming for 10 or 15 years and they've never seen one. And maybe someday we'll see that with some of the other tillage equipment that is out there. But it's tremendous what's been accomplished. And at Monsanto, we feel fortunate to have been involved in an industry making those changes, and an industry that's been so receptive to the innovations that we've brought forward to the industry to utilize to help with that, whether it be some of our herbicides or herbicide systems or seed systems, et cetera, as well as the many other companies in the industry that have also done their fair share of bringing those products. Not every industry is as receptive to new technology and innovation as I believe agriculture is. And that makes a huge difference. Today, sitting at the lunch table, we talk a little bit, this is so agriculture, we talk a little bit about what we're doing today, and then the whole conversation goes to where we're going. That's just innovation at its best. We spend most of our time talking about the future. You're going to spend time today talking about the future of agriculture and how innovation can continue to drive conservation tillage. And the statistics are astounding when you look at the progress that's been made. But we still have work to do. We've come a long, long way, but there's more to be done. And there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that when this group of people in this industry put their minds together to say, let's go after it, and we bring the whole industry together to go do it, we'll make a huge difference. And I look forward to joining you at a later point and seeing the progress we make in the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the next 15 years, to continue this path of innovation and this path of conservation and sustainability. And we'll get to see the fruits of other initiatives that are coming along with it. Whether it be Field to Harvest and other initiatives that I know will be some conversation later today about, that are also making contributions to sustainability in agriculture and tracking the impact that we're having. And I believe one of the most important things we can do is track things so that we can start to measure it and see where we're making a difference. And that's where we can start to build that platform from and start moving forwards from. And I'm excited about the progress we're going to be able to make. It's, like I said, no doubt in my mind that this is an industry that can make it happen when we all get aligned and get excited about it. So welcome again to Monsanto. I wish you the very best for the rest of the day. And also congratulations again to CTIC for a fantastic 30 years. And I look forward to the contributions of the next 30 years. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Begman. Right, we're ready to get started. And to start off our afternoon, we have a panel of 5 distinguished folks, leaders from agriculture and conservation, who are going to help us take a look back at the last 30 years of agricultural conservation. And to lead this discussion, we have with us a very good friend. Mr. Neil Strong is what I like to say first about Neil is he's one of my favorite people, and he's also a past chairman of CTIC, and he has a long distinguished career in agriculture with Geigy, Agricultural Chemicals, Novartis, and Syngenta. So he's been around for a while. He's received many awards and had leadership roles in helping to guide where conservation was going and the impact that it could make for agriculture and for the environment. So my pleasure to introduce you to Neil Strong.
Thank you, Karen. It's great to be here, and I would also like to, on behalf of my panel, thank Mosaic, Monsanto, Syngenta, and my personal sponsor, Syngenta, for this event. It's a great event, and I'm glad that CTIC didn't wait another 20 years, because I think I would have been too damn old to come. So it's good that you had it now, to have 30 years. It's remarkable. We do have a great panel. I've met with their campaign committees. We've agreed on a format. So they're all cool about it. Although, I do have to tell you that my panel does have an objection. I don't, personally, because I'm old. But they feel like they're too young to be looking 30 years back. They just, they're pretty bitter about it. Bill, you might be close to it. You're in my category. So they're a little bit hesitant about that, but I know they're going to do a great job, and I do want to introduce them to you. Their full bios are on page 4 of your handout, but let me just give you a brief bio and ask them to come up. First, Jane Frankenberger, head of Purdue University's Cooperative Extension Program in Soil and Water Engineering, and author of dozens of papers on water quality issues. So we're glad you're here, Jane. And second is Brent Haglund. Brent's president of the Sand County Foundation and the Bradley Fund for Environment, a longtime consultant on conservation issues, and the author of Wild Wisconsin and Hands-on Environmentalism. Bruce Knight, Bruce, a conservation policy consultant in D.C. I had to add that, Bruce.
Oh, thank you.
And a third-generation farmer and rancher. In fact, he'd just come back from South Dakota. In 2002, Bruce was named NRCS chief, a position he held until being promoted to USDA Undersecretary for Marketing and Regulatory Programs, where he served from 2006 to 2009. Bill Richards. Bill's an Ohio farmer, and I know that because I've been on your farm, Bill. He practices what he preaches, who served as chief of the U.S. Department's Agricultural and Natural Resources Service, NRCS. Why didn't I say that? It's a lot easier. Under George H. Bush. And fifth, but not last, my friend Steve Taylor, president of the Missouri Agribusiness Association, former executive director of the Environmental Resources Coalition here in Missouri, and a veteran of the Missouri Corn Growers Association and the Missouri Department of Natural Resources. You jumped over.
I can't stay. Just like you, Neil, I can't stand.
So we're happy to have this panel, and would you give them a warm welcome? All right, as I understand the format, we have an hour to discuss amongst ourselves. No heckling or throwing things from the audience. But if you have an important question, it's really a good one, you can interrupt us, all right? So, but we will have a half hour for Q's and A's from you. And I know a lot of people in this audience, and if you don't ask questions, I'm calling your name. So be prepared, all right? I'm retired, I can get away with things. We've all been talking about conservation over the last 30 years, and some of us remember conservation for 30 years, some like Jane and Steve and Bruce, maybe not. Brent, a little more so. Bill, you and I were there, bud. We remember it. We were there. But the first question I'd like to ask is about, and we just heard this from the president of Monsanto, is about the technologies that have advanced conservation during the last 3 decades. And Bill, I think you wanted to kind of start out on that one.
I volunteered. First, thank you to CTIC, and it's been wonderful to really visit with lots of old friends. It's also a privilege to be the old guy up here. I've also hopefully smart enough that I wrote down what I wanted to say, because they do say old guys get to repeating themselves. It's probably no surprise to anyone in this room that I say that no-till is the technology. I think we started something that's really become a revolution on the land all over this world. It's the breakthrough that really, I think, has made the greatest difference. I have critics that have always said that, well, no-till's not everything. Well, I'll ask you, so tell me what's second, and how far back is number 2. Farmers learned very early the savings of fuel, labor, machinery, management. We all know that. The conservation system saw the soil erosion benefits, and the actual soil loss reduction could be measured and could be quantified. And as that no-till curve went up, that soil loss curve went down on the charts. But the real gain has come from continuous no-till, and what we in Ohio are starting to call never-till. Soil quality improvements are beyond our dreams. Organic matter is increasing. Soil density is decreasing. Water infiltration. Sometimes we see a 10-fold increase in infiltration. Biological activity increases. Yields are increasing. Costs are decreasing. The machinery and the chemical industries have really responded with wonderful equipment, wonderful products. Planting is getting easier each year for all of us that are no-tilling. No-till helps provide more affordable food and fuel for a growing world population. No-till also makes available marginal or more fragile lands that will provide for the 9 billion people that are projected by 2050. Well-managed no-till is beyond sustainable. We can build and improve soil with no-till. So no-till is the breakthrough technology that we have, breakthrough technology really of the last 30 years. I'm interested to hear opinions, especially on this panel, of tell me what's in second place. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Bill. Bruce?
I'm a convicted no-tiller. I have been doing it for a number of years. Most of my fields have been no-till for well over 10 years, and we're seeing the benefits on the ranch this year as we're coming through a drought. But, you know, Chief, I love you, but I put no-till second.
Let's hear it.
Okay. My father came home from World War II and was still farming with horses, still putting up hay on the ranch with horses, and he said the happiest day of his career was when he sold the horses. And the single biggest thing that has improved sustainability of agriculture is actually mechanization. Now that goes back a little more than the last 30 years. But it's what has improved sustainability is we don't have to have 20 to 30% of our land base set aside to feed horses. And we've dramatically made, and this is what's unleashed all the things, including no-till. So I put mechanization first in the big picture, no-till in second, modern genetics with biotechnology as a subset of that in third, and then fourth is GPS technology. Because GPS is what's allowed us to now put precision conservation in place. You know, everybody talks about precision agriculture, but what we're actually practicing is precision conservation. Precise seed placement, precise fertilizer placement that really allows us to maximize yields, and when we maximize yields, we're maximizing efficiency. And I think I'm probably cutting hairs with you on this when I go back to mechanization first and no-till. But the key thing here is no-till only works if it's part of a system. And it's when we start looking at agriculture as systems and not as one technique, one technology, one crop or another, but we look at it as a system that started to really revolutionize conservation in an understanding that conservation is wholly linked with production.
Cool. You know, for a young guy, you got a really old soul and a good history. That's pretty good. Steve?
I definitely wouldn't want to disagree with either of the fine chiefs to the right of me, and my good friend Bruce I've known for a long time. So I won't do that. I'll add two. Maybe I'll add to the conversation, and maybe it's already out there in a way, but I want to emphasize, and that's going to be weed control. And you know, no-till, I think, went hand in hand with the increase in technologies we had in no-till. I was at MU, I was undergrad at MU in the early 80s, and my job I had was working for the Department of Agronomy, and we did weed pesticide testing. And back in those days, I mean, it's technology, chemistries that now have already faded away. Back then, they were just an experimental number. But I remember we were using some of them experimental numbers, and maybe, you know, given where we're at today, I shouldn't mention Monsanto, but Roundup. But we had other technology back in the day. It was Ciba-Geigy that we were testing. And I have to think, I agree with you that no-till was it, but we had to park those cultivators. We had to park that tillage equipment. And what made that possible was the weed control technology that came on the scene.
Good points.
And I think all of those technologies that have made it possible to solve many of the soil erosion related issues have allowed us in the last 10 years or so, this is more recent, as you said, is to think about the water quality issues that aren't tied to soil erosion. So it's the dissolved pollutants that have come into the fore in the last 10 years or so. and especially for we in the Midwest, in the Corn Belt, tile drainage being such a pathway that has been raised up as a very important pathway that we need to deal with in the conservation community. So there are technologies finally in the last 10 years or so that have started to come forward that can help us deal with nitrate in drains in particular, so bioreactors, drainage, water management. And so these are, might not compete with no-till, or certainly mechanization. As an agricultural engineer, I love to hear that one held up. But I do want to raise up the important role that drainage technologies are playing today and will into the future.
How do you see no-till fitting into that chain? Do you help or hindrance?
I don't know that there would be either help or hindrance. There's sort of two things that can go together very well. There are a few technologies that wouldn't go as well with no-till, but I think on the whole they certainly can, and so they're building up together. So it's one is dealing with the so erosion and surface runoff related parameters. Another one is going with the other part of the water that goes into the subsurface.
Sure. Okay. Brent?
Well, I want to say that most everybody approaches ag if they've been a practitioner out of their family history, and mine's no different. My family history was a family of Norwegian fishermen who went to northern Minnesota to farm rocks, and look how successful that was. My grandfather, my Norwegian grandfather, never ran a piece of motorized machinery in his life. Horse-drawn, yes. So I want to hit on three things that I think, to me, aren't directly going to get me caught in the crossfire between these two guys. They can fight it out, and whatever shootout they want to have. But I'm going to stress three things. Safety, accessibility, and sophistication that's useful. So broadening over this, because the question is, what technologies have advanced? Let me give you an example of what I think safety means. Safety means that the equipment is safer to use. I think the safety is, again, I can't extract my own personal experiences out of this, but I think back to the friends of the family who died in farm equipment failures. And I suspect most of us in this room have that, at least memories or been told those kind of stories. I think with the improvement of safety, we have access to equipment that a broader array of people can run and run safely and well. And it's not just a matter of brute force of managing a team of horses. Certainly skill is desired and necessary in that. And it further, in my opinion, a focus on safety, technology that focuses on safety and getting that thinking, helps to change the whole farm operation to one that thinks more carefully, more effectively, and looks at matters like insurance, like matters of meeting the standards of training of people. And so I think there's a general mindset that comes along here. It's that's going to help. It's part of the tide that's going to float all the boats. And the last two, other people can handle all of these things far, far better than me, but I think the accessibility of the devices, the fact that the prices are dropping and that they are now becoming more useful for that precision conservation that's getting closer and closer are critical.
Great. Great responses. You guys did well on question number one. Let's see how you do on number two, shall we? And that is about public-private partnerships. How have they contributed to the conservation movement, the conservation? Bill, I see you shaking your head. You want to tackle that one first? You're all over that one, aren't you?
Allow me to use residue management, that example. In 1990, we were failing to meet the requirements of the 88 Farm Bill, or 85 Farm Bill. SCS then, through CTIC, reached out to partners like Monsanto to form the market of the residue management initiative as the solution to meet the conservation tillage and compliance situation. I'll never forget a trip out here, probably to this building, with Dave Sheets and Becker. Are you Becker somewhere, John? Yeah. And myself. We come out to a meeting with the top staff of Monsanto. And that year, the ag press, the herbicide machinery, and the fertilizer industries all concentrated their advertising efforts to promote residue management. And Monsanto, I might add, really set the example. When all parties had something to gain, that is profit, it works. CTIC was really the vehicle to do what government does not do well, and that's marketing and working with partners. Thank you.
Okay. Who wants to jump in?
I'd like to jump in because I think Bill's hit the order correct in that to me, it's private-public partnerships, not public-private partnerships. There are the working farmlands of this nation and many of the nations of the world are private. The companies that have them inspired to be more profitable, better conserving operations are, if you will, private. We've got the blessings of the land-grant system. We've got a nation with a great array of university-trained, public university-trained and educated farmers, ranchers, foresters, and so forth that represent, if you will, public investments in it. But I want to follow up approvingly on Bill's point that it's the private first, it's the public later, and one of the reasons is that with all due respect to our great state cons in NRCS public service across the nation, I think it'll be the private leadership that enables the partnerships to thrive with public support.
Okay.
That's a fascinating point about private first, public second, because if I were allowed to ask a question rather than respond to a question, I'd be asking, is the private-public partnership as robust and vibrant today as it was 20 or 30 years ago? And I'm concerned as an ardent conservationist about what the answer may be on that issue.
Bruce?
Well, if anything, maybe it's a little more fragmented. You've got folks chasing dollars with NGOs, chasing dollars with the Farm Foundation or with the various foundations, and all of that's good, but it seems to be a more fragmented kind of thing. The other thing, when I look back at where we've made investments in agriculture in a conservation orientation, I believe that maybe 20, 30 years ago when we were giving birth to the various commodity checkoffs, we may have made the wrong decision when we said that checkoffs shouldn't be investing in production research. Because when we said we shouldn't invest in production research, that in turn made it so that checkoffs couldn't invest in conservation as well. Now, a few checkoffs aren't hampered with that today. And as a result, you see a significant investment that's out there. And I'll call out John Becker again. You know, USB is making a significant investment in sustainability now that they're able to do. Others are still feeling hampered by that. And so we have a significant financial resource that can be forward-leaning that's actually held back in our agriculture community in being able to do that. The other thing is, quite frankly, the kind of polarized climate that we have today politically is poisoning the well on the partnership side of things in being able to work forward in conservation. And that really concerns me, because almost every success we've had in the last 30 years on conservation has been because of partnerships. Whether it's private-public, public-public, private-private, or just neighbors getting together, which is pretty darn powerful. This climate is really polarizing that, and I'm fundamentally concerned about what I see going on.
Brent, looks like you're kind of itching to say something.
I'm going to hold.
You're okay, okay. Jane?
Just to give give some more examples where I think partnerships are working very well is some recent research projects that I know of. Again, I think of the drainage management research. Many of the NRCS Conservation Innovation Grants have partnered private industry together with researchers from various entities. For example, in ag drainage management, we worked with the Ag Drainage Management Coalition, the industry, together with the researchers, and with CTIC as well in communication to really move that forward. And I don't know how it was compared with 20 or 30 years ago, but I know that there are very strong and robust partnerships that are moving our knowledge base further ahead. And I want to also emphasize that it's not just private companies and maybe the government agencies, so that the public doesn't always communicate as well as it should either, and so partnerships are needed to move those forward. I've been privileged to spend one sabbatical partially at USDA and EPA, and now I'm partially at USDA again, and that's really a great experience for a land-grant university person. I'm also delighted that some of the non-governmental organizations, as you mentioned, the Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund, are here and part of the conversation as well. So partnerships are maybe broader than we have thought of in the past, and I think there are exciting ways that they're moving conservation forward.
Cool. Steve, you've been on both sides of that public-private equation.
Yeah, like I said, Neil, I couldn't said where I wanted to land for over the years. And I was just sitting here thinking, I agree with Brent. I like the private is the lead. And the other thing I thought on the question, kind of like Bruce, I like to ask my own question. I mean, the question inspires me to ask another question, which is, can we think of a case where there was ever a successful conservation effort where there wasn't a good private-public partnership? I can't really think of any. You're right, I've been on both. I started in the 80s and 90s working for the State Water Quality Agency, or Missouri Department of Natural Resources. But I worked on soil and water program issues, and everything we did there worked through the local soil and water conservation districts, the local farmers. There was the neighbor-to-neighbor program through then SCS, I believe it was, or farmer-to-farmer, neighbor-to-neighbor program, where farmers would showcase to other farmers conservation, a real leadership. But it was a partnership between the state, the federal, SCS in those days, and the farmers. But yeah, I'd ask the question, is there anything successful that happens in conservation if there isn't a good private-public partnership?
Good question.
If I may.
Sure.
Building particularly on Steve and Jane's points, a quick example. Madison, Wisconsin, known in many circumstances as 90 square miles surrounded by reality, nonetheless has broken out and is celebrated in Madison Magazine. And I brought a copy with me, the person of the year for Madison, and it's the Wisconsin dairy farmer, on water quality issues. And the kind of thing that Jane's talking about here, that Steve mentioned about partnership, is more eclectic, perhaps more, if you will, coming out of a fragmented base than you would. But among the partners that are making water quality improvements in the Madison, Wisconsin area lakes, the upper reaches of the Rock River, successful, and this is known to some of you in the room, are first and foremost the landowners, the dairy producers, who've got the most skin in the game. They've got major challenges in manure handling and management, among others. They've also got to pay taxes. And secondly, motorboaters and people who own property on the lake, again, on the lakes, private interest. Those were the two entities, and of course there are many other players, that kind of kick-started the county board into putting up money and encouraging the city of Madison's water treatment system, sewage treatment system, to begin incentivizing farmers for improvements in drainage management, for better manure handling, and so led, if you will, privately by interest of motorboats and dairy farm operators. We've got something that now has a public relations dimension, has a political dimension that is crossing the party lines completely. And you can't be between a Republican and a Democrat on that issue. And it is a terrific accomplishment. So,
great example. Thank you. Bruce?
I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about another great example of partnership that's out here, and that's really kind of why we're celebrating today, and it's CTIC.
Yeah.
And it is the value of what you can do based off of knowledge and the importance of knowledge-based conservation. And that's what CTIC, with a 30-year legacy, has been. And I've watched the organization ebb and flow, and I am just really proud of what I see the folks around this room have accomplished with CTIC in the last 3 decades. This group is vibrant, it's large, it's pulling together valuable information and disseminating it in a neutral manner that is really an excellent standard for all others to bear and to replicate. And it's a prime example of that partnership. Because to make partnerships work, we have to recognize that they work on a local level. And so that's part of why it's a little fragmented. It's got to be the right collection of folks who want to work together. And so this year it's in Madison. Next year the hot spot may be in Gan Valley, South Dakota, or the next year it may be over there. And the importance of having a CTIC and the other entities like it that are out there that are providing that knowledge base to wherever a partnership bubbles up is extraordinarily important. And that's, we can't have this conversation on partnership without everybody in this room giving a pat on the back to the person to the right or to the left of them, because it's the ownership you all have done in the organization.
You know, you think about it, over 30 years a lot has happened. And we talked in the first question about the technology, but if that technology transfer hadn't been there with CTIC and others in the partnership, the coalitions and the like, we wouldn't be as far along as we are in conservation today as we are. Yeah. All right. Anything else on partnerships, or shall we move on? We'll move on. Paul?
I just have one question. Maybe this is not the right panel, but I'm concerned looking at where we're going in the future. How do we get the youth involved? How do we draw in the next? Wow. How do we draw in the next generation or two to perpetuate this and make it sustainable?
You know, Paul, that's a great question, and we're going to give that to Sarah's panel.
Okay.
So you guys will have something to talk about. But that's a great question. We old folks out here, are there youth out there? Really
Chief Richards is objecting to your call. He wants to tell you the answer on that.
Chief wins.
No, but Paul, I don't think there's ever been a time in agriculture when youth was more important than today. I mean, these kids talk with their fingers. They don't even go through the paces that we went through. The advantage is going to the youth that are really technical, with a technical advantage in computer technology. And I think we should quit worrying about who is going to farm the land and where they're going to come from. I think we're here. We have them.
I'll be excited to hear what Sarah's panel has to say about that.
Let me jump in on
Oh my goodness, another chief.
I know it's going to be amazing.
I'm surrounded by chiefs.
Comment. I couldn't agree with you more, Chief. I mean, you look at it. I came out of school in the 1980s, and my father said, "Don't come home to the farm." Those were tough years, you know, and we're sending people away. I worked for 6 years with the National Association of Wheat Growers, didn't meet another person my age in that association until I went to the Red River Valley of North Dakota and met sugar beet farmers. Nobody my age was ever in agriculture. Yeah. You look at it now, young folks, it's tough, but if they got a willing partner, if they got a father, a family standing behind them, there's opportunities in agriculture, and there's folks going back into it. Now, the other thing to be watching is this whole sustainability movement. There's a ton of folks going to school studying sustainability and climbing into it. I got kids going to school in Fairfax, Virginia, 16 and 14 years old. They could not be prouder of what Daddy's doing right now because he's working on this thing called sustainability. It is very fashionable in the community. Half of my time as a consultant is explaining to mid-20-year-olds, where the sustainability movement and agriculture intersect. And there's a lot of opportunity for all of us in this field, because what we do in a profession of agriculture is extraordinarily exciting and vibrant for the food community and the sustainability community and the NGO community in a way that it's never been before. And for the first time in most of our adult lives, there's actually room for young people to come back to the farm. These are exciting times.
It is. Agriculture is a great thing to be in. All right. Outside factors like federal budgets, state budgets, WTO. There's a lot of outside factors going on. Population growth is certainly happening. How have those kind of outside things impacted conservation? And Bruce, I think you had an initial thought on that.
I did. I've been watching conservation for a number of decades and trying to participate as much as I can. And what I think has been the most exciting movement in the last 20 years is we've moved away from a strategy of idled land conservation to working lands conservation, where we've buried the old soil bank program. We're revamping the CRP program, and there's a recognition that we need to have working lands conservation, not idle lands conservation. This is a seismic change in the last 20 years in the conservation and environment movement writ large. When I look in front of us, for the last 30 years in farming, I have farmed with the mindset that I was taught by my father, which was I was one surplus crop away from economic disaster. Every year I knew that somebody was going to raise more beans, more corn, or more wheat than I was, and I was going to have low prices, probably in the year I actually had a crop to harvest in South Dakota. Those days are behind us. We're in pipeline supply because of the population growth in the world into the foreseeable future. And if we're going to feed 9 billion souls on this planet, and the American farmer has a role in that, even whether we're the primary supplier or a residual supplier, we've got to increase productivity sustainably. And this is just going to revolutionize both how we do agriculture, because we're going to be talking about sustainable intensification. We're going to need to be talking about how to increase production on the very best soils, how to maybe eke out a little bit more on some of the marginal ground, and how to preserve the most fragile and do that in a way that maximizes efficiency, whether you're talking nutrients or you're talking herbicide placement or you're talking fertilizer. And this is a seismic change that we're on top of, and I don't think any of us can figure it out fully and anticipate it, but we can if we do it together.
Do you think, Bruce, that political entities are going to be helpful or not helpful in that effort?
Oh, the political entities are so far behind us right now. My primary goal is for politics not to get in the way of it. If they let those of us in agriculture and the production aspect move forward and take the sustainability efforts right now, we've got conversations going on between retailers and farmers about how to answer that, and no government agency or entities there. And quite frankly, all they can do is get in the way anyway. Yeah. So these are exciting, robust times for us if we were able to manage through them.
Sure. Brent, you and I were talking the other day. Is this a time where you want to tell that story that you told me about a couple days ago?
Yeah, and it relates to particulars that both Bill and Bruce would have much more knowledge about than me, but on an issue not related to working lands, conservation, and ag. I happen to be at a close in a Senate subcommittee hearing a year or two after the 1985 Farm Bill. So the issue, just to make sure you know that it's not a working lands issue necessarily, had to do with the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. And I was at the time head of the Nature Conservancy in Wisconsin. We were in association with the Chippewa band in that area. And so in the development of a statement of Congress language and policy associated with that, I had a subcommittee meeting, and at the end of it, there was Senator Bob Caston, Senator Proxmire, Senator Bill Bradley, Senator Malcolm Wallop, and a couple of other senators. And as Bruce had pointed out a few minutes ago, there were times when Republicans and Democrats came together, and they did. So gathered together on this table. And to boil this little story into even a briefer thing, Senator Wallop from Wyoming started to tease Senator Proxmire about who was the better skinflint in protecting the U.S. taxpayer. Not related to this at all, but Wallop did congratulate the Indians and me for coming to something that didn't require any money. And he said, that's a good step. And then Wallop said to me, he said, young man, okay, it's a good thing. Okay. Cool. He said, young man, what does CRP stand for? So I rose to the bait, you know, like a trout coming up to a dry fly. God, I'm a sucker. So I said, sir, Conservation Reserve Program. And he just started to laugh and playing me for the fool that I was. And he said, no. And he said, conservation was an excuse. The driver was to protect small banks, small town banks, and farmers coming out of the kind of distress that Bruce had talked about. And my point about that is that sometimes these things come around to the benefits of working lands conservation and working lands agriculture when they come out of motivations that are not strictly pure, shall we say. Senator Wallop wanted to be reelected. He wanted to represent his constituents, and he was doing the best that he knew that he could. And then later there was more banter about, again, between them, but I took Wallop's point to heart.
Can I bring up
Please.
A couple of forces? First of all, I wanted to go back to the GPS technologies that was brought up earlier, because this is something that's happening around us. Our youth are more technologically savvy, but at the same time there are satellites both taking imagery all the time and making it possible for us to know exactly where we are at any point. These are phenomenal, give us phenomenal opportunity for being more precise. So there's precision agriculture, and we've talked about precision conservation for a long time. I'm not sure that that has really gotten inside conservation as much as it could, and hopefully the next panel will talk about sort of how it will over the next few years. But it's started to, and the technology has been developing around us and given us, you know, unbelievable potential, but I think yet unrealized potential to be more precise.
And certainly an outside factor.
Yes,
Yeah.
well, I thought, because
Yeah.
it's developing outside. But if you talk about outside factors, I think nothing can be as important as the climate. And some people might want to call it climate variability, climate change, whatever, but the climate is already starting to make a huge difference. And again, as we look forward, it certainly has to change more and more how we do conservation, how we think of conservation as the weather becomes more intensified in every way. That's a completely outside factor. I think the drought of this summer woke up many people to the fact that, you know, even in Indiana, we don't have infinite amounts of water, and we have to be cognizant of how the climate, as an outside factor, will interact. It does interact. Of course, it always has interacted with us in shaping our conservation into the future.
Sure, good and bad. Bruce Knight loves it, for example, in South Dakota, where it gives him more rain and a warmer temp. And
Not this year.
not so much. Any other comments on outside factors?
Well, I'll take you back to CRP. I really think that we should be more flexible. We should release acres from CRP. The world needs food. The world needs energy. At least at the present time, we need more acres. And there's some of those acres that can come out. There's some of those acres that should be extended for many, many years. But we need that. It should come out with rules. I mean, it should come out with rules that, for instance, that you have to farm it to tea so that there isn't a soil loss, there isn't an environmental problem. But folks, I think it's I'll get real strong here. It's almost sinful, as much as we need food in this world, that we have some land parked that should be utilized.
Okay. Let's move on. And Steve, I think you had a thought on this to lead off with, as far as the most single significant conservation achievement that's occurred over the last 30 years.
Sure.
And why do you think that achievement is so significant?
You're right, Neil, and I have more than a thought. So, and I mentioned that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Great.
so I appreciate the. I said I'd be quiet on some of the others so I could have some more time. But I want to tell a story.
All right.
I'd like to tell a story if everybody would indulge me. And part of the story will tie back to my home state, where you're at here in Missouri. But it also ties to, at the end of the story, I'm going to tie it back strongly to CTIC and what you've done here and back at the beginning of CTIC and how everything got started. So indulge me if you would. But I'd like to tell a story. And part of the story, I have to, for the record, give credit to a couple of people. I talked to Jim Gulliford with the Soil and Water Conservation Society. Jim and I are longtime friends. He actually was at the Iowa department when I was at DNR in Missouri back in the 80s. We kind of had similar jobs. Jim went on to do great things with EPA and other things, and I just motored along. But I have to give a shout out to Jim and some of the conversation I had with him. But the story I wanted to tell is, in talking to Jim and some others, and agree that, no-till, conservation till, those are some of the biggest contributors to conservation we've had. And if we looked at, why is that and why has that come about, we have to take a strong look at the 85 Farm Bill and the conservation title and what the role that it played to bring that about. And so at the national level, now in the state level in Missouri, back in the 80s, and all this I'm talking about is going to be back in the 80s, we had a big effort here in Missouri. Some of you might have heard of the Parks and Soil Sales Tax that actually funded the program here in Missouri. Brings in about $40–50 million a year. In Missouri, we have a lot of highly erodible land. We have a lot of high sloping land. And even with conservation till, no-till, having the ability to have terraces, and terraces cost money. A lot of money went to building terraces and stuff. So I got to hurry up here, Neil. You're going to kick me off the stage because I'm going to take too much time.
No, you're too tough.
Okay. But for Missouri, the kind of the founding father of our sales tax, a gentleman by the name of Merle Doty. He's a farmer in north central Missouri. And Merle was also very instrumental. He was the president of the National Association of Conservation Districts back in the early 80s. And Merle wrote a kind of a history of those times back in the 80s. So really quickly, I'm going to plow through this because I think it's really interesting. And it'll tie the state, the federal, and CTIC all together. And kind of, for me, I always think it's interesting to think about how a conversation you have here and there now, what effect that has 30 years from now. You'd like to think what you're doing now makes a difference. And I think this really kind of ties that together. So this is from Merle Doty, back when he was at NACD. He was in D.C. at the time, back in the early 80s, as president of NACD in congressional hearings talking about soil and water. He said, we were holding the spring board meeting in NACD in D.C., and Neil Sampson, from the executive director of NADC, came to me and asked me if I knew Peter Myers from Missouri. I said I told him I did, and that he said there was a rumor he was going to be chief of Soil Conservation Service, another chief. Peter would probably like to be here. Neil asked me if John Block and Peter Myers had any connection. Yes, I said, they are good friends, and Peter had lobbied with Farm Bureau to get John Block appointed Secretary of Ag. Merle said, I thought, oh brother, Reagan is trying to downsize FCS. It's a really interesting read. I would recommend it. I had a fun time reading all this. They asked me to give Peter a call to find out if the rumors were true. I did, and Peter was running a tractor in the field at the time. So this is the early 80s, and Peter Meyer had a phone in his tractor at that time. I told Peter there was a rumor circulating out here, and out here that he was coming to Washington, D.C. to hit up SCS. He said yes, he was. I told him I thought he was going to step into a hornet's nest. I know it wasn't easy for Peter to maneuver between the administration and conservation needs of America. Peter did a good job, as anyone could have done in the circumstances. Peter and Merle knew each other. Now I want to jump ahead a little bit. So the history is, you know, he became chief and was involved in, you know, in the early 80s in some of the crucial steps of putting together the Farm Bill and the conservation compliance. What I have here is a speech from Peter Myers from July of '83, and I'm proud of these guys. These are Missouri guys, so I have to admit that for a fact. But this is a speech he gave in '83 to the Southern Conservation Tillage Conference for Sustainable Ag, and it was on conservation tillage. And he starts out by saying conservation tillage is a key feature of the National Conservation Program, a fresh approach to USDA's Conservation Assistance Program that President Reagan sent to Congress last December. He continues expounding the benefits of conservation tillage, cost effectiveness, and this is, you know, I can't take credit, but he talks a lot about how this was possible through weed control. So that wasn't my idea. I have to admit, I thought of that having read this. But at the very end, I'm at the end here, I want to read this, being while we're here today. At the end of the speech, he says this. He says, conservation districts and their National Association Conservation Districts, again, you know, having been friends with Peter, with Merle and the president of NACD. He said, conservation districts and NACD deserve a great deal of credit for their leadership in promoting conservation tillage, and particularly for helping create the Conservation Tillage Information Center, CTIC, in cooperation with the agribusiness community and USDA. CTIC is gathering and spreading information that will encourage a better understanding and more effective use of conservation tillage on American farms. A monthly newsletter already is being issued. Other parts of CTIC's information network will include literature and research reviews, speaker bureau, demonstration projects, telephone referrals, liaison with industry partnerships, liaison with industry, government agencies, university, organizations, associations, farm groups, and individual districts. I thought that was really keen, Neil, that, and I just liked how all that tied together. And I just wondered those guys, you know, 30 years ago had any idea how all that was going to play. So I appreciate your indulgence and let me do all that.
Great story. Dick Fell, you probably remember some of that.
I would just like to comment that Peter Myers was a real champion, and he worked with Jim and I and the other people. And John Block, I used to walk down the street with him and tell him about CTIC and what we're trying to do in that, and he was supportive. So those two men were very critical in the beginning and the growth of this organization.
Great.
If I just one more step through, so, you know, taking that story from there, and then so Peter Myers came back and repaid the favor. Probably got a lot of Farm Bureau friends in the room here, but at the state, the sales tax that is going to bring in $50 million to state sales tax was a tough issue for Farm Bureau. Peter Myers came back when we were having that debate. He came back to the state convention for Missouri Farm Bureau, gave the keynote address, a speech that mentioned the importance of having that. I'd give him a lot of credit for making that possible and bringing all that conservation to Missouri. Yep.
Well, let's go down the line. Bill, what's the most single?
Well, I'm going to comment. I was friends of both Peter and Jack Block. I was able to really work with Peter and talk him into no-till. Never did Block. His land was too flat, black, and good. You expect me to talk about conservation tillage or no-till. However, let's look at the big picture. Look at the achievements of the conservation system, much of which you talk about, both at federal, state, local, and more importantly, the private level. It's continued to develop and instill a conservation ethic that's the model and the envy all around the world. Look at the soil classification system. Look at our mapping technology, really, that was built the foundation for the precision ag that we have today. Drainage design, waterways, ponds, levees, I could go on and on. But it's our voluntary approach that really gets conservation on the land. largely without regulations, at low cost to our customers, and I think at a fair cost to the public. You know, we've developed and taught soil conservation principles at the very beginning, you know. Little simple things like we first learned. Rain must fall on residue, not on bare soil. Don't let water run off, walk it off. Take some of you old timers in here to remember these things that, you know, farm the best, conserve or preserve the rest. Leave it better than you found it. Of course, it works in all walks of life. And a Mosley principle that I was looking through my notes last night, Jim, and we're not supposed to be talking about policy here, but Jim's policy and approach was reward the best and motivate the rest. I think we should be very proud of our achievements.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you. Bruce. Top that.
This is a tough one. I can't top that. I'm not going to try to top that. It's going to be the things like we've been talking about, the no-till, the degree to which we've largely abated soil conservation. Still work to be done out there. But the gains we've made in water conservation, still work to be done there and all that. I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about a more personal, significant thing in the last 30 years as pertains to conservation. This gentleman to the left of me was chief of NRCS and taught a young congressional staffer or a young lobbyist, I can't remember exactly where I was at the time, that it was okay to be a Republican and to be an ardent conservationist. And it was Chief Richard's mentorship for me that turned me into a conservationist, beyond just the practice on the farm, but to what I can do in a broader level. And so that's a personal story for me, which doesn't quite fit, but I got to plug it in someplace. But it also talks about how important those thousands and thousands of personal conservation stories and mentorships are. Because what has been successful over the decades about conservation partnership has in fact been that one-on-one partnership, whether it's one farmer taking another under wing and teaching them about no-till, or some consultant telling everybody in the world that'll listen to him about cover crops, or a individual out there working on those things. That sort of mentorship is what has really been a key to making conservation partnerships work over the last 30 years.
Brent?
Stepping outside of those wonderful and necessary stories, I think there are a couple of other things that would jump out at me as being conservation achievements, not perhaps the most significant, but help to set a stage of understanding of opportunities for partnerships, for collaborations, for getting across the barriers between party lines. And I'll just briefly mention two, but I'll say that if you read the headlines of 1982 and thereabouts, and I did some sampling of that, acid rain featured prominently. There was still significant coverage of point source water discharge, water pollution issues. Those have, to a large degree, thanks to the generosity of the American people and the leadership of many people, Republicans and Democrats in the political sector, left the headlines because they have been not solved, but to a large degree appropriately managed, and are coming around to be less and less of requiring our attention at time. And I think the administration of George H.W. Bush, which was the time when the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act are an example of partnership, of technology being a key driver for improvement to this, to use voluntary trades of emission reduction credits to lower the amount of SO2 in the air, to help take away the threat of acid rain, which affects working farmlands in some part of this nation, and to do so. And just one little thing, the prices that were estimated in the late 1980s as to what, or late 1970s as to what they would cost, per ton of removal. We're estimated to be about $700 per ton. When the actual trade started in the early 1990s, trades were at about $300 per ton. Now the achievement of that is being done at $88 per ton. Markets work, voluntary transactions work. We can achieve an enormous increase in environmental quality by freeing up the intellectual capacity and the technology that people have access to. And this is just one example of it.
Being here coming to this event has really helped me understand history, and I do love history, but one thing I'd never heard before was how in the 80s CTIC was really needed just to introduce people to the technology. I didn't really live through, I didn't work in conservation during the time when there weren't technologies that allowed you to do no-tillage. And so it's great. I drove over with Dan McCain, talking with Jim Lake today, the people I know, but we haven't really talked about how the technology needed to be researched and developed. So I really am in awe of all that was accomplished then and how much great work was done at that time. So I certainly think there's a great foundation for conservation. As I think of what's the greatest accomplishment, maybe it's just that we're all here and that so many companies and partners feel that of course we talk about conservation, that it's just a given now and we think through it. Just to talk about the future a little, I think that I hope that we continue in that spirit of discovering the best technologies. Now we know how to do no-tillage. There may be some improvements, but what we really need to look at is the water quality, the contaminants that do not move with erosion, because we know how to deal with those, but those that are dissolved. So it's the nitrates, very large amounts of nitrate, dissolved phosphorus, and some pesticides that are not affected by the erosion control, fabulous technologies that have been developed by so many of the people in this room. And so that now we set our sights on getting the technologies well developed and get into use that can help us deal with the dissolved water quality issues just as much.
So there's more to do.
I'm afraid there is. I think everyone agrees.
The next panel have all the answers for that, by the way.
Just one quick comment in the beginning to tie into what you said. It was CTIC, Conservation Technology Information Crusade. Crusade, and these men, Mosley, Richards, Myers, all those guys and all of these people and the people in this room were on a crusade. And we did spread the word and we did make it happen.
Cool. Well, we're not going to get to all 6 questions in this group, but that's okay because the 6th question that we had is more futuristic anyway, and I have a feeling that's going to be covered. You know, a couple weeks ago, or last month, I was able to go to American Soybeans Association partnership meeting that they had with their grower leaders and leaders from industry and others, many others. And I was very pleased at that to see the percentage of time that they spent talking about sustainability. And one of my comments was, isn't that synonymous with conservation? And so I'd like your comments about how we've moved over this period of time with conservation, now sustainability. What's your thoughts on that as you look back? Steve?
Well, it seems like I remember back years ago, you heard first, I remember first hearing about sustainability, and it was kind of skeptical maybe, like what's that all about? And then we moved into a phase, I think, where and maybe we're still to some extent still there, defining sustainability. You know, well, what is this, sustainable? I think we're starting to coalesce around, a understanding of sustainability where we all kind of like, okay, we know it when we see it, everything. But we're getting around to a term of sustainability that basically around, environmentally profitable, environmentally safe, and that's those sort of benchmark fundamental deals. But I've seen it gone, Neil, from we're kind of skeptical to an embrace, and I have to give a shout out to my friend Laura and the whole TFI group and our 4R program. And Laura, I believe you've included sustainability as part of the 4R foundation for our nutrient management right source, rate, time, and place. I get that right? Thank you. But what I have, why this is really top of my mind right now is because I'm part of, you know, even though I don't have it, it's been 20 some years since I worked there. I'm back at DNR quite a bit nowadays in my current role as a stakeholder, and but we're working on a nutrient management reduction plan, and it's really worked well, this sustainability, because it's part of the 4R program, and the folks at DNR and the other stakeholders and a lot of the environmental groups that are part of this stakeholders group, when you say sustainability, and we've tied it to this nutrient management program, it's worked really well to the fact that, Laura, I haven't talked to you about this, but earlier this week in our meeting, we officially adopted the 4R program as Missouri's nutrient management. And so it's really been a helpful thing, the sustainability thing, as far as we got to an embracement. I mean, it's kind of a common language for a lot of the stakeholders, the ag groups, environmental groups, and others.
Okay. I want to tell the panel we're running a little bit out of time, but any other quick responses on this? Brent?
I'll quickly go, and I'll say that one of the things that CTIC does is provide those pages of the hymnal that people of different perspectives can look at and read and begin to sing together from. It's critical.
Cool. Jane?
And I just wanted to go back to the gentleman's question about the youth, because I think sustainability is really a key term for looking at the next generation and how they think of the next generation. So they are good at holding our feet to the fire, that's saying just managing for the next 10 years, 20 years is not enough. We need to look further in the future. So I think that's a key term there.
Rapid fire, Neil, on sustainability. Exciting thing about what's occurring on sustainability is it moved from a belief system and is moving towards a science-based system. Used to be folks with tie-dyed shirts, and I couldn't even talk about sustainability at the coffee shop at home without folks thinking, Bruce has been on the East Coast too long. Now it's gone mainstream. And it's going mainstream, and I'm comfortable with it's going mainstream because of the way those of us in agriculture are using life cycle assessments to put science behind the measures of sustainability. And the surprising thing is the measures of sustainability teach us that what our daddies taught us when we bought our first piece of land, which is leave it better than when you got it, the science supports what Dad taught us when it comes to conservation. And we now have the metrics to take to a skeptical public and show them that conservation works.
Great.
I'd just like to echo the sustainability in more than production. It's economics, and it's also must be socially acceptable. And we have to really help the public understand. We must sell this idea to the public.
Great. Thank you for your responses. And now the easy part's over. We hear from our friends out there. Questions? Sir.
Sometime in the, I guess this is working, sometime in the early 90s, I wrote a case study on CTIC for a Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on technology transfer, because I thought CTIC was the best example of technology transfer that I'd ever been associated with. But in writing that and in publishing it and working with it in an international stage, what I realized was this is not a very repeatable experiment. And the reason it isn't is because of the institutional framework that it fell into. When you had people like Dick Fell sending thousands of salesmen out, talking to landowners, when you had the Farm Bureau behind you, when you had all the conservation districts, when the Extension Service came on, and the land grant system, and the agencies like SCS at the time, that was a communications network unparalleled anywhere else in the world. And so my question for you all is, how important do you see this the institutional framework, and do you see any threats to it tending to ravel at the edges at this point that might preclude us from continuing to do the kinds of things that was done with CTIC?
Wow, I'm glad I'm not a panelist. Bruce?
I appreciate what you said, Neil, because it's something that I've been wrestling with for a while. Is what we got to do is figure out how to replicate the CTIC model and the entire voluntary model and replicate it around the world. Because what's at stake is a North American model of a combination of conservation and production versus a European model of constraint, regulation, and restriction. And what's at play is which model is adopted in South America, and I think we're winning the one in South America, which one is adopted in Asia, and which one is adopted in Africa. And I'm very comfortable that this model will get replicated in South America. Hopefully it's getting picked up in Asia. It seems a little more sketchy, but it's Africa's in the cards here. And it tends to follow a European model that I'm afraid could actually constrain food production in that continent as opposed to unleashing it. Give you an idea of how powerful the information provided by CTIC and NRCS and everybody else is around the world. I was traveling in Israel, met with a group of my counterparts in Israel. I met then with what is the equivalent of an NRCS district conservationist in some backwater office in Israel, and he says, I want to show you something. He pulls out an NRCS printed engineering manual on small watershed dams, and he says, I use this every day. And that's when I understood the power of the information provided by CTIC and all the conservation partners. If we put that out there in the internet in a way that is available to the public, it will get out there. So what we should be actually doing is, should we make our conservation investments available not just in English, but in Spanish, and any number of other key languages in order to really spread this conservation movement around the globe.
Very good.
There's also an Australian model out there called Australian Land Care that takes a really different approach in that they start with industry and industry partnerships. Not only disseminate information, they fund conservation.
Right. The land grant.
Yeah.
Or land. What's the name of that?
Land care.
Land care, yes. Brent?
If I could comment briefly, I think there are parts of the world that are open and in which we don't need to translate it into Swedish. The Swedes can read English, and that'll be just fine. And I think I agree with Bruce that Europe is a tough nut to crack. However, European nations have enormous debt. Some of them are coming to grips with this in more productive ways than others. And Sweden, for instance, and Finland, both struggling with the issues of the growing hypoxic zone in the Baltic, are coming to the United States looking for CTIC type approaches and we're providing them CTIC type of information. It's the fact that their model in a way is bust, and this is a more appropriate one. So we have dairy farmers in Sweden communicating with dairy farmers in Wisconsin using, if you will, land grant type approaches, and we don't need to translate into Swedish.
I didn't think to think about international connections, but what a fascinating question. So I worked in Africa for 8 years, and one of the questions that always came up was, how is the research supposed to be translated into the ordinary farmer? There's no clear, extension system. The more you work overseas, the more you're in awe of whoever figured out our extension system, that there is, goes from research to being used. And so I just want to put in a plug that the technologies directly, of course, wouldn't be translated. Research is needed in Africa, the continent with which I'm the most familiar. So I hope that we all support them doing the research that's needed to develop the conservation systems that work around the world. Institutionally, I don't know if it can be replicated, but it's a fascinating question.
The single most important thing to replicate around the world is the soil survey. If you want to unleash the economic juggernaut of Africa, is to actually use modern technologies to map the soils so that that resource can be properly tapped into. It is the single thing that, to me, would make the biggest difference. How you get AID or anybody else to actually focus on such a elementary, simple solution is beyond me, but we got to get that into the public domain. in countries that have not made that investment.
Okay. Other questions?
Yeah, Dan Towery. A few moments ago, you were talking about selling the public on sustainability. Yet if we look at the past 30 years, we have more and more of our people in this country who think that the food comes from the supermarket or McDonald's. The question I have is, as we talk about selling sustainability, absentee landowners are a huge factor that we have trouble with. I would like your comments on just, again, is there a connection between sustainability, conservation, and food production?
You know, one thing that I've always been surprised that we didn't do, and that's try to put a price tag on what raising organic matter does in the farm real estate marketplace. That's the kind of things that landlords will look at. We haven't done a good enough job really selling the long-term productivity gains that go back to the landowner. So I think you've really hit on something that we need to really concentrate on. I figured up once, and then, of course the figures have gone haywire with the prices now, but I think I could work out the economics to show that 2% rise in organic matter will add about $2,000 an acre in our present market. And that's money.
Okay. Other questions?
Neil, I have just for you, since you're one of the largest agricultural companies in the world today, and Monsanto and Bayer, are your people and your organizations, and going to Europe and going to Asia and going to Africa, are you spreading the CTIC word? Are your people involved, et cetera?
Well, I think so. I won't speak for the other companies, and I really can't speak for Syngenta now because I'm retired, but I'll speak from the past. How's that? I'm safe there. I think so, Dick, because it's in their best interest to do that, because the technology that's being developed is really part of the information. We need the information exchange for that technology to be fully utilized. And so we're in harmony, if you will, with the conservation effort and with getting that word out, because as that technology improves, we sell right into it. Other questions? Yes, Sarah.
Just to build on the question that Dan had answered about absentee landowners, most of who are female. Over the last 30 years, we've identified that, especially as we go into Africa, we have to start communicating to females who are oftentimes the responsible ones, the small stakeholders. In your careers and looking back, were we communicating the conservation message effectively to the right gender on the farm?
Well, you're absolutely right, Sarah. I remember a group in Chicago, Lynn, I think you were part and parcel of introducing that group, the Chicago Farmers Club, right? And heavy membership was females, you know, older females. And what do y'all think?
Sarah.
I think you're right to be asking the question. Yeah. There's nothing the farmers in my community fear more than when the widow ladies get together for coffee and compare rents. My dream is for them to actually compare notes on how well they're doing. You know, just yesterday, my brother and I were looking over at the fence at a neighboring field that I'm seeing them bale up the corn stover this year. They're going to sell it because of the drought. They baled up the wheat straw last year. They're going to sell it because they could make money. I see them just pounding that ground. And long term, that guy shouldn't be farming. But that guy's farming probably 30,000 acres. And what unfortunately can happen today is one person's sloppiness and mistake can devastate 30,000 acres when it used to be only 300. And so it's legitimate to have this conversation with landowners about, you know, how to look over the shoulder of your tenant and make sure that you're achieving conservation objectives, and understanding that simple things like writing into a lease, maintain the organic matter at the present level or increase the organic matter, those little things in a lease make all the difference. And that the single largest restriction on any of us in agriculture is access to the land base. So if we actually empower people who control that land base, that they don't have to be locked into a particular tenant because that person is renting the land if they're not meeting the standards, and you give them the power to do that, you can move mountains on it. You know, and that'll help, but the real thing is, regardless of who operates the land, regardless of who owns the land, I'm gender blind on it. We need to empower people with a conservation ethic. And that's what we really need in the community, is that conservation ethic.
But you know, Sarah, those women are getting their first introduction to sustainability and conservation from their children that are coming home from school. So I think we really, really ought to be thinking about how we can really get women into our meetings, into the technology that's available. I think that could be exciting.
This is kind of for Steve and everybody else, but I was a land management biologist back in the early 80s. I knew Merle Doty well, and Mr. Peter Meyer came to Missouri as well to talk about our program with the Department of Conservation, which was part of the Green Hills area in north central Missouri. I think it was second in the nation for soil erosion. With $7 to $8 corn, that's our biggest enemy right now. And not only that, but general consolidation. Try to find an 8-row planter right now. Great Plains makes one, but everybody else has gone 12, 16, or 20-foot plus drills. What is the big idea when you've got $7, $8 corn and land speculation and return on investment to people that really don't understand soil stewardship? How are we going to make that bridge? Not that $7, $8 corn is with us forever. I realize that.
Well, you can tell I'm rocking back and thinking about that. I'd like to talk to you more about, I'm not sure I'm right with you about the economics, the price of corn. We look at, and I mentioned, I'm just so knee deep right now in nutrient management issues in Missouri, and it's a lot for a lot of Midwest. EPA is being sued by a group of environmental groups to set nutrient criteria. But in that, I look at the crop budgets, the price of corn, the price of inputs. If you look at them relatively, they're pretty even. I don't know. I look at, and I think CRP had its place. We talk about, though, and I agree that there's a place now to maybe take some of that land out of production. We got such high prices of corn right now, but I'm really convinced, and I believe we can have very good conservation, working lands conservation. And you're right, $7, $8 corn, $12, $15 beans, what have you, really puts the pressure on, put a lot of land in production, intense production. But I believe somebody, Bruce, you might have said too, I mean, the technology now of modern agriculture to really bring to bear the high technology for conservation, I think we can sustain high price, high intensity, and be conservation. I think it's, I'm not sure, very high crop prices now are the same as very high crop prices 30 years ago.
Go ahead, Chief.
As recently as this April, the price of corn had dropped under the cost of production for many of those farmers with the 30,000 acres. And so, don't get carried away on the sky's open for us. I mean, let's keep our feet on the ground. Go ahead.
Now, I personally, from my time with government, found myself to be a reluctant regulator. But there is times when you've got to make the right linkages for the folks that are a little slow learners on the wisdom of stewardship and such. I think one of the things we need to do is we need to link conservation compliance with crop insurance in a major way today. Not because I'm worried about 98% of the farmers, but I'm worried about the one bad actor that we all have in our neighborhood who doesn't do the right thing. And I think we should make the swap of restricting conservation or restricting insurance eligibility for that one bad actor if they're farming straight up and down the hills with not even trying no-till for those things. I think that's a modest trade. I don't even know if I'd call it a regulation. I think it's just legislating a little common sense. And so I think we need to take that aspect of conservation compliance and extend it to crop insurance eligibility, and we need to do that in a major way. I look at the polls and I see 80–90% of the farmers in this country agree with that, but I see the farm organizations disagreeing with that, and I think we need to find back to a common sense kind of solution that we would have had 20 years ago. So I think that's one of the things we've got to do to get at this. The other thing is we need more mama cows in the Midwest. There are few things about water quality in the I states that wouldn't be better solved with a few mama cows with 4 hooves on grass than than 4 tires on tractors. And we need to figure out a way to put livestock production back into the mix in the Midwest, and especially with the Corn Belt moving west and north, we're losing it in other places as well. And this mixed, diversified agriculture has vital conservation benefits, where you're raising corn and soybeans on the best ground, you're raising cattle on the worst ground. I know I am regarded as being 20 to 40 years behind the times on that mindset, but I think we have a lot of environmental answers that could be achieved with just a few more mama cows out there. You know, I look at the number of people that are out there chopping corn stalks right now that, you know, a black and white cow with 4 hooves eating those stalks does the exact same thing a lot cheaper, and I'd like to see a lot more of that around.
You know, Bruce and I stuck our neck out along with the 2 other old chiefs on the idea of bringing conservation compliance to insurance. I look at conservation compliance as regulation protection. I think that's one of the things that we could do that would really help us with the environmental community. It's something that we should be doing anyway, and if farmers don't want to be regulated, well then that kind of compliance is the answer.
And crop insurance is the single most important public policy tool most of us in agriculture have today. And when you look at the number of folks who criticize the public investments that are made in agriculture spending, if we could actually link up the conservation community with the crop insurance community and the farm community, you've got something that makes crop insurance investments of public dollars sustainable for the next 20 years. And right now, with that community at loggerheads, it's not going to be sustainable for the next 20 years. And we need to have 5 years from now or 20 years from now, when we have the next CIT sustainability conversation, we got to have crop insurance here as a partner at the table. And we don't have that dialogue going on today that'll bring that about.
Gene, did you want to? Okay. We have time for one more question.
All right. Comment or question about sustainability. I'm sure everybody in this room agrees that sustainability and conservation tillage and no-till go together. But when you get outside of this room, not everybody agrees that no-till or conservation tillage is sustainable. Probably some of those children Bill, or grandkids coming home talk about sustainability, to be blunt about it, they blame or they hate Monsanto. They hate all these herbicides. So how do we educate to the outside public that what we're doing really is sustainable and a key to long-term sustainability?
That's a great last question. Who would like to tackle it first? Steve.
I'm affiliated with a lot of different groups with our association, a lot of regional, national group. I'm affiliated with MACA, Mid-America Crop Life. We have an ambassador program where you go out and the members talk to, go out in the schools and talk about the role of herbicides. And the members that do that come back and say, wow, they really understood it, they really got that. I just think it's just going to be a good old-fashioned hard work doing that kind of thing. Those type of examples is one answer.
Let's go to the science, Randall. That we really know that tillage drops organic matter, degrades the soil. Without tillage, we have to have herbicides. That's why we're all here. Atrazine come on the market just about the time we started playing around with no-till. So that, I don't think we've sold that idea even in our total scientific community or our university community, that really it's, we need to stop, we need to do away with that tillage. And we have the science, but we haven't told that story.
Jane.
Sometimes we treat things as more black and white than I think they are. I think there's one thing I heard last night that the Field Farm Movement is working on, continual improvement, and I think that might be, in many cases, a better concept, that we're always getting better. And I was really delighted to hear that, Chief Knight, that you were working on life cycle assessment metrics. And so I hope you'll talk a little bit about how that can be set up with the question of herbicides. So what we try to do is set up a set of metrics and see if people can agree on what the metrics are. And then a particular technology shows up somewhere on the metrics and we can keep rising up. So it's not a good versus bad, it's a little bit better.
I've had the luxury of well, not only is it's not always a luxury, sometimes it's painful, but I've had a chance to look at a number of organizations' LCA investments, from dairy to some of the grains groups and what's going on out there. And uniformly, across the board, when you start putting the science to it, whether you're measuring reductions in greenhouse gas emissions or reductions in water utilization, irrigation efficiency, or water quality, the science points out that the North American model of conventional agriculture works, and it works extraordinarily efficiently. And it turns some folks in the sustainability movement on their head. Because folks generally assume, oh, well, a grass-fed steak has a smaller greenhouse footprint than a conventional steak. Well, it doesn't, because the grass-fed steak's 28 months old instead of 14 months, so that cow's been belching and farting for 28 months instead of 14 months. It changes the whole nature of the game immediately. And that's what the science gives you, and it works whether you're looking at an LCA on corn or soybeans or dairy or kumquats, and that's the exciting thing about the science. Now, with that said, the other thing is we got to get over and this is where I actually give Secretary Vilsack great credit. We got to get over it's either conventional or organic. There's actually is room for both, and for both systems to be out there. But we got to stop tearing each other down and one saying I'm better than the other, or the other one does this or that. But you know, if there's somebody that wants to pay more for organic, God bless you. Go if you can service that market and you want to service your market, go for it. But for those of us that want to just feed a whole lot of people and do it very efficiently, let us have conventional agriculture and let's coexist.
Cool. Well, you know, we've had the task of looking back 30 years, and a great thing about a panel like this, our vision is 2020. As you look at it, and I think it's pretty hard to summarize all the great comments that we received from these fine panelists, but I think we can look back with pride and progress on where we've come in conservation in the last 30 years, and it's due to a lot of factors, in no small part CTIC. And it's been a real pleasure to work with this panel, and I've really enjoyed them. I hope you'll enjoy them as well.